In this module, you learn about tool use by LLMs, and that means letting your LLM decide when it might want to request to have a function called to take some action or gather some information or do something else. Just as we as humans can do a lot more with tools than we can with just our bare hands, LLMs too can also do a lot more with access to tools. But rather than using hammers and spanners and pliers, when we give tools, that is functions for an LLM to request a call, that's what lets it do a lot more. Let's take a look. If you were to ask an LLM that's been trained maybe many months ago, what time is it right now? Well, that trained model does not know exactly what time it is, and so hopefully a response sorry, I do not have access to the current time. But if you were to write a function and give the LLM access to this function, then that lets it respond with a more useful answer. When we let LLMs call functions, or more precisely, let an LLM request to call functions, that's what we mean by tool use, and the tools are just functions that we provide to the LM that it can request to call. In detail, this is how tool use works. In this example, I'm going to give the getCurrentTime function that I showed on the previous slide to the LM. When you then prompt it, what time is it, the LM can decide to call the getCurrentTime function that will return the current time, which is then fed back to the LM in the conversational history. And finally, the LM can output is, say, 3:20 p.m. So the sequence of steps is, there's the input prompt. The LM, in this case, looks at the set of tools, which is just one tool in this example, but looks at the set of tools available, and it will decide in this example to call the tool. The tool is a function that then returns a value. That value is fed back to the LM, and then finally the LM generates its output. Now, one important aspect of tool use is we can leave it up to the LLM to decide whether or not to use any of the tools. So for the same setup, if I was to ask it how much caffeine is in green tea, the LLM doesn't need to know the current time to answer this, and so it can generate an answer directly. Green tea typically has this much caffeine, and it does so without invoking the getCurrentTime function. In my slides, I'm going to use this notation with this dash box on top of the LM to indicate that we're providing a set of tools to the LM for the LM to choose to use when it deems appropriate. This is as opposed to some examples you saw in earlier videos where I, as a developer, had hard-coded in, for example, that I will always do a web search at this point in the research agent. In contrast, the getCurrentTime function call is not hard-coded in. So it's up to the LM to decide whether or not it wants to request a call to the getCurrentTime function. And again, we're going to use this dash box notation to indicate when we're giving one or more tools to the LM for the LM to decide what tools, if any, it wants to call. Here are some examples of when tool use may help an LM-based app generate better answers. If you were to ask it, can you find some Italian restaurants near Mountain View, California? If it has a web search tool, then an LM might elect to call a web search engine for querying restaurants near Mountain View, California, and use the results that fetches to generate the output. Or if you are running a retail store and you want to be able to answer questions like, show me customers who bought white sunglasses, if your LM is given access to a query database tool, then it might look up this table of sales for what entries had a pair of white sunglasses sold and then use that to then generate the output. Finally, if you wanted to do an interest rate calculation, if I were to deposit $500 and after 10 years at interest rate of 5%, what would I have? If you happen to have a interest calculation tool, then it could invoke the interest calculation function to calculate that. Or it turns out, one thing you see later is letting an LM write code, like just write a mathematical expression like this, and then to evaluate it, that would be another way to let an LM calculate the right answer. So as a developer, it'll be up to you to think through what are the sorts of things you want an application to really do, and then to create the functions or the tools that are needed to make them available to the LM to let it use the appropriate tools to complete the sorts of tasks that maybe a restaurant recommender or a retail question answerer or a finance assistant may want to do. So depending on your application, you may have to implement and make different tools available to your LLM. So far, most of the examples we've gone through made only one tool or one function available to the LM. But there are many use cases where you want to make multiple tools or multiple functions available for the LM for it to choose which, if any, to call. For example, if you're building a calendar assistant agent, you might then want it to be able to fulfill requests like, please find a free slot on Thursday in my calendar and make an appointment with Alice. So in this example, we might make available to the LM a tool or a function to make an appointment, that is to send a calendar invite, to check the calendar to see when I might be free, as well as to delete the appointment if it ever wants to cancel an existing calendar entry. And so given the set of instructions, the LM would first decide that of the different tools available, probably the first one it should use is check calendar. So call the check calendar function. That will return when I am free on Thursday. Based on that information, which is fed back to the LM, it can then decide that the next step is to pick a slot, let's say 3 p.m., and then to call the make appointment function to send a calendar invite to Alice as well as to add it to my calendar. The output of that, which hopefully is a confirmation that the calendar entry was sent out successfully, is fed back to the LM. And then lastly, the LM might tell me your appointment is set up with Alice at 3 p.m. Thursday. Being able to give your LM access to tools is a pretty big deal. It'll make your applications much more powerful. In the next video, we'll take a look at how to write functions, how to create tools to then make them available to your LM. Let's go on to the next video.